My name is Beth Back. Okay, I wanted to welcome everyone as Director of the Middle East and Middle East American Center at the Graduate Center, the City University of New York. I'm thrilled to welcome you to this year's inaugural event for the Mellon Sawyer Seminar on Race in the Middle East, North Africa. We would like to thank the Mellon Foundation for the opportunity to host events this fall and spring. Excuse me. And our co-sponsors for today's conversation on race and empire with distinguished Professor Ann Stoler. And our co-sponsors are the PhD programs in anthropology and history and the MA program in Middle Eastern Studies at the Graduate Center. I'd also like to thank Jeremy Randall, Assistant Director of MEMIAC, for his work on this event and all events, and my colleague, Professor Christina Richardson, who will be curating questions through the chat function later on in the conversation. At this point, I'd like to introduce my colleague and co-convener of the Mellon Sawyer Seminar, Professor Mandana Limbert, who will be moderating the event and introducing our speakers. Professor Limbert is Associate Professor of Anthropology at Queens College and the Graduate Center. She's the author of In the Time of Oil, Piety, Memory, and Social Life in an Omani Town, and co-editor of Timely Assets, Politics of Resources and Their Temporalities, as well as the forthcoming Life Worlds of Middle Eastern Oil. Her current project examines changing notions of Arabness in the course of the 20th century in the Indian Ocean.
Thank you, Beth. Welcome everyone to our inaugural event for the 21-22 academic year. As Professor Barron mentioned, we're grateful to the Mellon Foundation for the opportunity to convene the seminar for a project that we've been working together on for many years, starting with a workshop almost 10 years ago now and teaching a class with our esteemed colleague, Professor Christina Richardson at the Grad Center. So we were thrilled to have with us in the spring, for those of you who weren't able to join us then in the spring, to have with us an event, Professors Dorothy Roberts, author of Killing the Black Body and Fatal Invention, Professor Eve Trout Powell, author of A Different Shade of Colonialism, and Tell This in My Memory, Tales of Enslavement, and Elise Burton, author of Genetic Crossroads, speak about race and the politics of genetics in the Middle East and the US. A recording of that event is available on our website. While our project is centered on the Middle East, our aim is to extend a conversation about racialized histories and politics within, through, and beyond the region. In that spirit, we're excited to have the opportunity to invite today distinguished university professor Ann Stoler and professors Marie Brown and John Collins to the virtual Graduate Center. Just a few words about logistics. Rather than interrupting the flow of the discussion later, I'll introduce our three guests now. After that, Professor Ann Stoler will have the floor, speaking for about 45 minutes. Then Professor Marie Brown will follow with comments and questions. And finally, Professor John Collins will do the same. Professor Stoler will respond to those comments and questions, and then we, the hosts and co-hosts, will collect further questions from you, the audience, through the chat. We apologize in advance if we can't get to all of them. And if you have colleagues and friends who are unable to join us today, please let them know that we are recording this session. So it's my honor and privilege now to introduce our speakers. Distinguished university professor Ann Stoler's works are, as you all know, breathtaking, both in their force and subtlety, a combination that propels and grounds her intellectual projects. She sees through fields of scholarship, noting how the tensions and pains of inequality and personal relationships are products of uneven and yet sustaining processes. Her attention to sex and sexual morality and the making of empire, and the ways that ambiguities are not obstacles to racial thinking, but the condition for their possibilities, inspires us. And her work on the mobile essentialisms of racecraft in metropole and colony has been critical. But of course, there is so much more. She is the Willy Brandt Distinguished University Professor of Anthropology and Historical Studies at the New School for Social Research. She is the founding director of the Institute for Critical Social Inquiry, the co-founder of the journal Political Concepts, a Critical Lexicon, the recipient of many awards and grants, and of course, she's the author of innumerable articles as well as monographs and co-edited volumes. Capitalism and Confrontation in Sumatra's Plantation Belt, Race and the Education of Desire, Carnal Knowledge and Imperial Power, Along the Archival Grain, Duress, Tensions of Empire, Haunted by Empire, Imperial Formations, Imperial Debris, Thinking with Balibar. And I'm pleased to announce, and I hope we hear about more today, that she has a new volume with Oxford University Press expected early next year, Interior Frontiers. It is our honor and pleasure to have her here today. It is also our pleasure to welcome Professors Marie Brown and John Collins. Professor Brown is a historian of Imperial Sudan and the Middle East at the University of Kansas. She is co-director of the Gender Seminar series at Kansas and the author of numerous articles, including In Touch, The Body and Sensibility as Historical Text, and the beautiful monograph, Khartoum at Night, Fashion and Body Politics in Imperial Sudan. John Collins is professor of anthropology at Queens College and the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. He is also the author of numerous articles and chapters, including most recently, Vital Properties and Afro-Brazilian Lives, as well as the monograph, Revolt of the Saints, Memory and Redemption in the Twilight of Brazilian Racial Democracy, not to mention the co-edited volume, Ethnographies of US Empire. I should note that during fieldwork this week on his new project on hunters in New Jersey, he had a mishap. Fortunately, the mishap did not involve firearms or crossbows, but it did involve a battle with a 5-inch diameter poison ivy vine. And unfortunately, the vine won. But John, as itchy and swollen as he is, and I've seen pictures, it's not pretty, is still joining us. Hopefully some antihistamine will help. And if you'll let me, I'll take over some Persian comfort food later to Astoria. In the meantime, please join me in welcoming distinguished university professor Ann Stoler as she takes us through a discussion of her intellectual trajectory. Thank you.
Thank you, Mani. That was really beautiful. And thank you all for being here. And thank you for having me. It always feels somewhat awkward to talk about oneself, even though we always do all the time, even we don't realize it. But at the same time, a kind of mixed treasure to think through one's intellectual and political trajectory. The people who have been part of it, the places that stirred one, parts of which I don't think I even know. What's emerged for this reflection today is somewhat unexpected to me. A set of formative scenes and moments from my earlier years, which I've really rarely talked about. I've done tons of interviews, but only mentioned some of these, that each time I tried to unravel, seemed to adhere to a set of colliding narratives. These collisions surface virulently at some times, other times careening into one another, almost behind my back. It's strange to think now that the concepts and metaphors that hold me so many years later, recursive history, the plating of history, how knowledge things are assembled, the Foucauldian appreciation that every sentiment has a history, that an event, as Foucault said, is not what I thought, but a breach of self-evidence, appearing sometimes direct in my own history, sometimes distorting in my life's folds. I should try to be clear. The truth of oneself, several volumes of Foucault's, is really hard to reckon and hard to say. I think this account is more intimate and far less polished, that I know, than I intended. There is no originary story here, no eureka moment when the intellectual and political crescendoed into what I knew I needed to pursue and was going to do. I think now that the range of seemingly disparate relations and things in which I've sought to forage and burrow that is to unearth and as coverage for myself, are not untethered to those early collusions and collisions, that they belie compromise between bold and unreasonable aspirations, inappropriately brazen refusals, shielded compromise, an anxious threat of insecurities, shaped by a racialized precarity that my father seemed to have taught me in his silences and in his roar. He knew them too well when growing up in a Lower East Side tenement. For me, they translated into not ever being smart enough, skilled enough, thin enough, or bold enough, all expressing something fundamental about how the pressures of being a good white girl in a family where distinctions of class and privilege so mattered. These facts of my family's history, in some uncanny way, made colonial pretensions resonate with me later. A white, dubiously superior managing class riveted my attention, in part because they were so evident in the optic in which I grew up. Sentiments of envy, shame, fear of being found out, and never as deft at anything as the craving for it demanded. They coursed through my work, sometimes expressing those contradictions of inclusion and exclusion with an almost lyrical, biting rage. Think of the titles that I never sort of put them together, except when Val Daniel, in an interview in Public Culture, was the first question he asked me, he said, "How did you get these titles, Anne?" And I said, well, I think they were aspirations more than what I'd actually done. But I think here of this rage of educating desire, tense and tender ties, and most recently in the titles and subjects of the essays that I've just finished in my forthcoming book. One essay is called A Distaste for Race. There are taste for race and a distaste, le goût et le dégoût. Poetic rage on what I think of as the anti-colonial avant-garde. Weaponizing the senses. And another chapter on all things being equal on carceral labor. And then the very title of the book, Interior Frontiers, which Mani didn't get to the subtitle, which is important for me, Essays in the Entrails of Inequality. Each, in some circuitous way, were affected, I think, by the undertow of a family location in the social order of things for which I had no interpretive purchase at all. I kept being attracted with almost unwavering attention to those on the pernicious edges of never knowing enough, of professing not to know, and knowing too much. Those contradictions surface as much in the final chapter of Along the Archival Grain, which I called then Imperial Dispositions of Disregard, but think of now as the politics of regard so much more broadly, where it's not ignorance, but ignoring, that provided the possibility and provides the possibility of living with social privileges while distancing oneself from ever acknowledging one's enjoyment of them. Not unlike the lives many live so disparately in the US as an imperial formation today, while withholding and disdaining any allegiance to its inequities of privilege and wealth. I could start the story with an account of growing up in a Jewish home where faith was only a pretense. The Holocaust was never discussed, and being Jewish was something I decidedly knew I did not want to be. I could tell it like a story that went from that to my Jewish father's use of the pejorative. I won't say it now. Someone just suggested I shouldn't, because it would probably be quoted by someone I don't want it to be quoted by. But it starts with the letter K. At the dinner table, knowing that he, without admitting it, used it in part with affection, in part as a fear that those he loved might be called by that derision, in part by the fear that it was about him. I remember thinking that my Russian-born mother, orphaned within months of arriving in New York at 12 years old, bore a warmth and beauty that just couldn't possibly be Jewish and of unidentifiable class. These sensibilities and my family, as an instance, became a trope, as many of us know, the self-hating Jew. That was the post-World War II condition and was, among other things, Philip Roth's career. The ambiguity of this self-hatred was played when I was invited to a Gentile debutante party, and my then budding Sanskritist older sister convinced me I should defiantly wear all black, where white and pink were the norm. The mothers all glared. So in an origin narrative, one could argue that studying race and imperialism were there from the start, but they weren't, not really, even in an incipient way. They all made up different threads of where I would go. They were thick, they were thin, some extended, some cut short. Or I could start from growing up during the Vietnam War in the mid-1960s, in high school, going to my first demonstrations, all excited, going to the city when I don't think I even knew where Vietnam was. Or that it had a furiously and ferociously violent colonial history. My sense of its history, it's so embarrassing, only reached back to the US. It was only after in 1968, as war protests and demonstrations escalated, as did the war, that I started really reading Marx and Lenin. What is to be done? Sat on a bus with Howard Zinn, an icon of the anti-war movement, on a trip to DC to march against the war. That's when I became increasingly hooked. Barnard and Columbia were then, where I was, were then the embodiment of Esposito's white immunitas. We marched around the edges of Columbia, awed by the force of the Black Power movement, but far from it. We barely knew, at least the people I knew, how deeply honed, sophisticated, deeply rooted it was. Imperialism, it's interesting, was on our lips in protest, a key word of the day. We knew that Vietnam was somehow a victim of US power. Barnard and Columbia were exploding in protest. I was in Hamilton Hall, of course, making the peanut butter and jelly sandwiches, not giving the talks. And the university gates on Broadway, over the Jim Splain into Harlem. Many oblivious. Was this the regard of looking away to the convergent and far earlier growth of the Black Power movement, with racial violence right at our door? Our focus was on capitalism. The anti-war movement made itself, and this is important, made itself blind to the racial project, which was to keep white middle-class college students out of military service in Vietnam, and therefore obliged young urban Black draftees to serve instead. It doesn't mean that there weren't whites who did, but it was really strong. Our protest at the time was Honeywell and other insidious companies, the capitalist cronies, as we call them, making napalm. For us white kids, jailed for only one night in the tombs, but we were so proud of it. There was something fundamentally distant about these protests. We confronted the police and of course went to parties afterwards, but it was still with a temporary bravado. It was not in the flesh. We were protesting Honeywell's production of napalm and its targeted decimation and murder in Vietnam. I had never sought to find out how it was made, only later learning that it was from an incendiary compound that produced so much carbon dioxide, it was impossible to breathe. Demolition and asphyxiation followed. The composite was used first in World War II. Later in the 1970s, it was made up of a powdered aluminum soap of naphthalene and palmitate. Some say it was a combination of naphtha and palm oil. I had begun studying rubber and palm oil as a doctoral student at Columbia a few years later, getting it into my head at the time that history is from the bottom up my cherished Bible in graduate school being E.P. Thompson's The Making of the Working Class, that only condoned history from the bottom, that history only condoned histories from the bottom up, that it also demanded, and I think that why it demanded it is something I'll try to talk about in a moment, an understanding from the top down. It was interesting that my Bible was the history from the bottom up, but my own work increasingly went to the top down. One could argue, should we imagine to tell a fictive originary narrative that palm oil and the synthetic rubber developed at Harvard to replace the latex in rubber short supply for these bombs was somehow unconsciously leading my way to my dissertation project on rubber and palm oil plantations in 1979, on the forms of protest and labor mobilization on that. Or one could construct a narrative that my later thinking on along and against the archival grain 30 years later emerged from that time. Again, I'm not sure that such a neat narrative has any traction. I imagined merchants of capital and agribusiness as the devils in disguise. I hadn't yet read McTow's Devil and Commodity Fetishism that came out while I was in Paris finishing my dissertation. My dissertation subject was not lauded by friends and comrades in Colombia or in Indonesia. Plantations, everyone said, they were on the way out in the 70s, vestiges of a colonial legacy, a word I never use, the plantation condition as if a thing of the past. I was convinced it was not. It was impossible to live on and near the plantations without experiencing that sedimented history that was shaping the present. From the older estate workers who descended from their bikes when they saw me, when passing me, or the estate manager's home they would get off as well when no one was there. From the workers' quarters to the Javanese compounds where I lived, sprawled on the squatter fields around the plantation edges. Plantation workers were paralyzed in silence under the fascist President Suharto, in power since the massacre of alleged communists in 1966. And that's when I was there, not in 66, but during this period of paralyzation. As it turned out, those friends of mine and colleagues were wrong. And I was wrong to listen to those who dissuaded me from the project. Trying to choose a place to work, I had migraines virtually every other day in Java and curled up on a bed. I didn't know at the time that palm oil was to become the #1 destructive environmental force in Indonesia for decades after I left, and still is now. Millions of hectares taken over, huge amounts of deforestation, forests and planet animal life destroyed. And most remarkably, the companies committed to the same labor strategies used 80 years ago under colonialism and 50 years ago later in North Sumatra under Suharto when I was there. Some great work is coming out by Tanya Lee, who has been studying that plantation condition now, and she's just kind of startled by the resonance between my work 50 years earlier and her own work now. One thing was clear at the time. My interest was in capitalist exploitation. Colonialism was somehow relegated to a back seat. After the fact, it was the context in which I was trying to figure out the labor system and the evasions and submission and sabotage of it. In the colonial context, sexual and familial relations were key to how labor control worked. And that I got at the time. That was my introduction, really, to feminist thinking in another vein. The exploitation of manual labor encompassing the sexual labor of women and their bodies, precariously strung on the edges of plantations with half the pay of men doing exactly the same work, selling their bodies as was the intent of Dutch policy. They wrote about it, and then condemnation of them for doing so. It was only then that I found a way to ask about the camps of prostitutes on the plantation edges when I was there, near the railways, never visible from the roads that passed by the estates invisible to outsiders, but well known in and outside the plantation borders. It was the Dutch documents, it wasn't yet in the archives, labor reports, that one of the earliest pieces I wrote after finishing my dissertation was called Perceptions of Protests. I wrote that in the 1980s, came out of how protest was understood and recorded in the documents themselves. Have I really left out? I'm leaving out so much, I can't believe it. Have I really left out the 2 years I first spent in central Sumatra between getting my BA on the rural roots of the Chinese Revolution, get that, right? And leaving for Java to be with my then partner, Ben White, before going to graduate school when I spent my time learning, this was in Java, about how the Herald Green Revolution decimated the lives of landless women, and that it's miracles that the World Bank was so excited about and hailed as reaching the poorest of the poor never made it. In Central Java, I felt like I was on the fringes of imperialism. I was looking to be in the belly of the beast, in the multinational industry of plantations. Again, I was really naive, so unaware of the colonial capitalism as the architecture of privilege and profitability and the production of enormous wealth in Java itself. Capitalist extraction steamrolled through the North Sumatra with agribusiness and Nike and Reebok after using that rubber from the rubber plantations. Oil companies like Mobil were already in Aceh and North Sumatra. Biofuel production and massive deforestation were on the horizon. Still, I went to Sumatra in pursuit, not really of a colonial nightmare, but a capitalist nightmare. It was when I first began thinking about and using the term colonial capitalism. My references still on development of underdevelopment of Andre Gundre Frank, Wallerstein, Hobsbawm, Marx, Rosa Luxemburg's much earlier insight were my guides. But so were the Dutch colonial labor commissions, reports on labor unrest and outside agitators. Racial ambiguities, for formations and fault lines. The uneven and disparate range, let me take some order, that's okay. Of projects I've pursued over several decades often lead to questions by students when giving lectures in Europe or elsewhere. Well, how did I move from an avid Marxist to relentless pursuit of the insights and strange dismissals of Foucault? I admit they're untidy. They are. My interest in the hardened and mute exercise of racial violence has long seemed to me to thread through sexuality, the residues of Agent Orange, the politics and distribution of sentiment, why mixed children were both a threat to racial orders and the very category produced by those orders themselves. I don't think I ever set out to study and teach on race. I think it's fair to say that what's pushed my work to find its direction are two central long-term concerns: the structural conditions of inequality, how those inequities are produced, maintained, and fortified, visibly and invisibly, through imposition and persuasion. They are grounding in networks of extraction of multiple kinds, from large-scale multinational plantations to the fine print of World Bank incentives to harvest rice with sickles by men, rather than with a small blade held between two fingers by women. From the degradations in which extreme right groups invest, which so much took up my later work, to the racial protocols cultivated in colonial contexts and racial formations. But there's another political and powerful concept that's held me fast, and it's related. Not that I write about it much, though I did, finishing my dissertation in 1982 in Paris and working with then the famed Maurice Godelier, considered the Marxist anthropologist, even though he was the Dauphin, it was the product of Lévi-Strauss, which he's just written a 600-page book on, somebody who just detested Lévi-Strauss and then became the person to write about it. Also not following at that time, there I was in 82, the unbelievable late lectures at the Collège de France of Foucault's. I was following Bourdieu. It was the concept of subsumption in Marx, a concept that was more capacious, I thought, than exploitation, that blurred the boundaries of how people were subsumed, the boundaries of wages and the restrictions on daily life, where people could live, what they ate, how much schooling they could get, why there was no electricity in the village where I lived, and then, alas, one glaring light bulb in each house. They were not a rural peasant as they were conveyed, rather a rural proletariat. That time in Sumatra turned me in a strange way to European whites more than anything else, who masqueraded as people of a class in ways I'm sure I've never reckoned with. It was a time that I hardly realized that the course of my work was changing. It was not an event, but some undercurrent that turned me from a focus on colonial capitalism, as it had been, to how people assure themselves and make themselves white. This was, as we, far before whiteness studies, when everybody got all excited about it. And I was shocked decades later when it came out as this new thing. It was that colonialism made vivid how much whiteness, blanchité, être blanc, mattered with its so eerie familiarity. I think that moment, unbeknownst to me at the time, also turned me to the metropole in a strange way, to the circuits of knowledge production that moved back and forth through the circuits of commodities and people and ships and government reports and private letters. So when Fred Cooper and I said, metropole colony, it should be one analytic category, working off a small piece of Barney Cohen's early work in history and anthropology, that just exploded a lot. Something else happened, though, between 1983 and 87, when I left Sumatra and immersed myself in how, it's the first thing I wrote, one of the first things I wrote, not the first, how colonial categories were made in an almost unfathomable range of sites and ways. Race was a defining formation. Architecture, infrastructure, structure of dominance, distribution of sentiment, saturating colonial documents, shaping the very contour of the colonial archives. Sometimes it was surreptitious, sometimes it was in bold font on every page. Rarely was the word ever used. It was the ways in which distinctions were belabored and discussed. It was in the anxious deliberations on being white and how to maintain it, on who could marry whom, on what to do with abandoned children of colonial white men and Javanese women. It was a seemingly solid, at least people wrote about it as solid, racialized world that was crafted. Its imaginaries, its portents, its anticipated revolts, as important. These are things that were in the conditional tense because they never happened. As important as the signs that read, quote, "No dogs or natives allowed," at the entrance of white swimming pools in Java, where contagions themselves were made. All of this drew me into the metropole, into the lives of those fresh from Amsterdam. This was a project of looking at Europeans again and again. How am I going to get through this? Do I have time still? I'm only halfway, and I didn't even put everything in, but we'll try to give it a try. We have all special moments when things we thought we knew and how we knew them are all of a sudden not decided, but open doors, portals that one didn't even notice were there before. These are moments when the tight seams of what it thought we knew begin to unravel, and the very fabric phrase. I've discussed some of these in other contexts. If people are interested, I could just send a bunch of, Tamani, a bunch of interviews that have been done on this. So I don't want to belabor them all here, but they are each marked by what came to be more and more obvious to me as I work through the arts of governance and the crafts of rule. Probably the most striking is when I was reading legal documents and what it took to be granted European status in the Netherlands Indies at the turn of the 19th century. And what transfigured my world was a clause in a sentence that one, quote, had to feel at home. Gevoel feel te house at home in a European milieu. I was totally floored. How could that be assessed? How could this be a legal document? Who could do that assessment? Who could say what it feels? And what kind of evidence would you need to prove it? I've been trying for another 30 or 40 years to figure out how this racialized belonging, this racialized logic, the dispositions it was supposed to entail for years and years now. The second, also emerging in the late 1980s, was not from the Dutch colonial archives, but from the French colonial ones between Aix and Marseille. And again, it was the same kind of question here in a court of law in Haiphong in 1898 of what was supposed to feel, one was supposed to feel to prove that one's sensibilities were really French. You had to show you hated Germans, that you spoke French as you were supposed to, that an ill-educated ship hand, that was the category of petit blanc, a poor white, who adopted a Vietnamese boy, couldn't possibly really want that boy as a son and be his father, but must be his lover. I don't think I need to say why this mattered. How they mattered is basically evident on every page of my work, as it was in the archives themselves. Once again, it was the cultural coordinates of race, not the biological, not the physical. It was these cultural competencies that mattered more. This was so contrary at the time to even some of my dear friends, to how scholars wrote about the development of race, from a as if it was a biological to a cultural phenomenon now. So contrary to how I saw the racial lines, both protean, changing, and redrawn. Essentialisms were there, but they were never fixed. That is probably one of the strongest insights that I had in the 1990s. Not that there weren't essentialisms, but they had changing borders, changing attributes in them. That was part of governance itself. Over and again, I was drawn to those on the ambiguous borders of who was us and who was them. Early on, I was reading work on the US South. That was one of some of the earliest stuff I read on why the category of whites of no means were called white trash. Were they trash because they were not endowed with the white cleanliness and purity with which real whites were endowed? That was the whole Esposito's notion of white immunitas. As it turned out in the Indies, the category of European paupers was never clear. Those living in rural villages, their status as white and European were always subject to some méfiance, some distrust and erasure. The same was true when I began looking at the education in the Indies. It was not the subject that mattered, but the instilling of it, educating and cultivating the attributes that would channel one's desires. So virtually every book and essay I've ever written, even though I'm not getting to them all, I'm not getting to all the work on the Front National, I'm not getting to the work in Java, I'm not getting to working on the pipeline as a waitress when I pretended to drop out of Barnard, but I really only took a leave. I mean, that was part of that construction of being always a rebel, but still within the fold in some way. That I've written since the late 1980s takes these uncertainties of identifying race, the production of criteria that was imagined to succeed, but so often failed. And not least, I think what really excited me about working in archives was to identify hesitations, marginal comments, ambiguities in this assemblage of things and persons and conditions and comportments that were imagined to make up racial difference. Instead of imagining and portraying white rule as a firm and established set of mandates, I was struck by the indecisions and inconsistencies. And again, the very protean, polyvalent mobility of those assessments. Nor was it, and I think it's important again, when we contrast so much that history with our own, and then we use decolonial as if we know what it's about, nor is it that talk of racism is clear. They too spoke in familiar contemporary terms. I'm not racist, but that's colonial. That's not just now. That was absolutely part. We think of they were just outraged, racist, and let everybody know. No, there were all of these layers of its formation, and a lot of it through humanitarianism itself. I plunged into the French colonial archives in Aix when there were no lines to get in. Now the queue is enormous. I worked in the Dutch colonial archives next to the old white men tracing their genealogies of power. No one wanted to help me, absolutely, or acknowledge I was even there. But one lone archivist, without whom I would have sat every day pretending to do work, eating my little broodje in Dutch, this favorite little sandwich, and my work totally astray. I haven't even gotten to putting my 40 boxes of colonial archives when I went on sabbatical in Aix-en-Provence, closing them up. I started opening them and closing them up. And instead I followed the Front National, the extreme right, to one of the villages where they were most profoundly installed. My lefty friends then too made fun. I mean, it was warmly, asking me, was I going to visit my, Le Pen Front National friends today? Why did I want to study someone who was new, who was nothing, and who would remain so? And the same conversation, I'm not going to identify who it is, to a very prominent anthropologist, philosopher, years earlier, just a few years earlier in Paris, said, why are you possibly wasting your time with a book on Foucault? He's over. He's passé. That was 1994. Sometimes we listen to our closest interlocutors, sometimes not, but they always matter. Students, friends, enemies, colleagues. So let me just stop here, even though there's no finish. Critique is not over, as Latour would have it. The fact that he could say that really is unfortunate. The fact that it doesn't look like what he knows, or as it once did, emanating from the same quarters and the same sources, with the same locutions, is the good news, not a sign of its irrelevance or demise. Maybe some of us, that is of my generation, I hate to think of myself as older, I still think of myself as 40 or 50, need to learn to recognize some of the new forms it takes and appreciate what counts now very differently as engaged scholarship and what counts as the political. Thank you so much.
Wow, thank you so much. Thank you so much, Anne. So I will pass it on to Professor Brown and your comments, and then Professor Collins.
Yeah, wonderful. So I just want to begin by saying what a privilege it is to listen and exchange ideas with Anne Stoler, who has provided me with a critical vocabulary and ideas for my own work. So thank you to Beth and Mandana for asking me to be part of this conversation. So my assignment was to talk about how Anne's work sort of applies to the field of Middle East studies, Middle East history. And I think I might sort of throw that out the window. So I have one thing that I like to say about sort of the application to Middle East studies. But then
what do you mean by throw out, Marie? You mean get rid of, or you mean throw out?
Oh, I'm going to get rid of it. Toss it out.
Right, good.
And then I have, I think, a number of more personal, private process questions that I think actually bring us back to in more oblique ways about the importance of studying race and what it does and what it can do. So my sort of my broader sort of application to the field is, for those of you who are unfamiliar, there is a real sort of resistance, I think, in Middle East studies to acknowledge the importance of race in our scholarship, right? And then that has certainly been changing, and this seminar series, right, is evidence of the group that is working against that. But really, I think over and over, so many of us who are invested in race have felt hampered by this pervasive attitude amongst the field that questions of race don't apply to the Middle East because race looks so different, right, in the Middle East. And I think this is where Anne's work is just so instructive, right, in that as a scholar, she has persistently challenged, your words today were brazen refusals of seemingly agreed upon categories, right, concepts that we claim to already know. And so I think you've really sort of shown us a way to get out of saying, racism only looks like this, right? Or racial violence only happens in these particular ways. And in one sense, that's an intellectual exercise. But I think the harder work is acknowledging, right, the durability, right, of these colonial presences, these colonial moments, and to see race as not just something that the Middle East field needs to study, right, but that our field needs to reckon with as continuing as a community of scholars. And this is where your line from Duress, strange continuities, I think is so important to identify the sameness, but also the difference, right? And to be sort of upfront about this heritage that we are all living and working in. So that's kind of my top level appeal for the sort of the real application of Anne's work to our field in general. But I wanted to move then to the more personal in thinking about, I mean, another thing that I think and you do so well is locating racial difference in and racial power in the smallest everyday moments. And so there are, I'll just cite one point from Carnal Knowledge, and you have an interview with former Javanese servants who have these detailed memories of the contrast between the bland, monotonous meals that they were asked to serve, and then the food that they created for themselves. And that, I think, is just so important. And again, perhaps an entryway for people who are resistant to race, right, to get into these small moments. But your work has developed, right, and you've moved past intimacy as affect to just really acknowledging the violence, right, that can come with that closeness, and the uncomfortability and the ways that we lose control over these private spheres, and so my sort of first question then, as I struggle with this, is to think about how to balance moments of caretaking and food and the intimacy of torture, for instance, is what do you do when you find joy in colonial archives, right? And I'm struggling myself with how to think about moments to talk about, I guess, sort of racial exchange or tension that seem to be perhaps more joyful or sympathetic than perhaps these easier categories. And then I'll ask just sort of one more big question. I think I've got so many. My own personal work is on bodies and bodies text as evidence of history and historical change. And you had a moment in which you said you were getting migraines thinking about where to choose the appropriate site for your work. And I wondered if you might also offer some comments on how work in these tense, traumatic topics of race, of violence, of sexual inequality become felt on the body of the scholar, right? Yeah. And how do we I guess, move past this, certainly in history, the ideal that we are objective scholars, right? And that we are going to enter this moment not having feeling for our subjects. And I think you and anthropology as a whole, right, might be able to talk a bit about, how do we feel our own research on our bodies? I have so many more questions, but I'm going to leave it there because I know that those are big monumental ones.
Wow, these are beautiful. These are great questions. We could talk for hours.
Oh, good.
I mean, this is just, oh, so many. Where should I begin?
And
Oh, you're not doing it that way.
no,
Oh,
we're gonna let John ask
okay, I'm
his
sorry.
question.
I was going to
That's
respond
okay.
there. Okay.
We're gonna let John ask his questions, and you can take on both sets of questions together. Because then the conversation will go on for hours, which I love.
Go ahead,
John?
John.
Okay, well, I hope I plan to go on for hours because I have so much to say to Anne. I've learned so much from her across the decades now, and it's an extraordinary opportunity to be here. I really thank Beth and Mandana and Marie and Christina for allowing me to join you here, and of course, Anne. I have to say that
Everyone should know first that I learned as much from John.
you've always been too kind to me, Anne. And I mean that. Let me just say, to start to begin, that basically, I understand, I'm going to not ask discrete questions because I think Anne, I have many, but I think Anne, in fact, responded to one of my inklings and questions, and I'll put forth how. But I have to say that I'm inspired by her statement, by her discussion of the way that the anti-war movement made itself blind to the racial project. And I understand some of the things that I'm doing today as my generation's attempt to analyze something similar that may be going on, and to do it in relation to anthropology in ways that are inspired substantially by Anne's work. So let me just sort of precede this, and I say, the end of what I'll talk about is I really want to get to Donald Trump's statement that there were good people on both sides at Charlottesville. And my way of doing that, or what provokes me to do that, is to think about race and empire in New Jersey, where I happen to be working now, even though I spent most of my life working in Brazil. And of course, thinking race and empire in New Jersey is extremely easy. At the same time, it's very, very difficult. What I find is that I'm being pushed to denounce Iraq War veterans who like pickup trucks, hunting, and InfoWars. In fact, I had one very noted editor when I explained to this person that I perhaps would write a chapter of a book in dialogue with, let me say I'm studying hunters of white-tailed deer in a rural region of New Jersey. And I explained that I might write a chapter in dialogue with this hunter. And the editor looked at me and said, John, you write the chapter. We really don't want to know that side. In other words, I was to mediate it. So I'm struggling now in my mediation, and I'm working through Anne's work to think about how to do that. Well, let me say that I'll begin here. Capitalism and confrontation. I'm going on memory because COVID doesn't permit me access to my copy, but a recognition of supposedly hermetic worlds that are not hermetically sealed, namely the Plantation, is central to that book. And that is central to what we've heard today and central to Anne's work. Also central is her talk. At one moment, she talks of her befuddlement, almost a depression at the gulf between managers and workers, and the way that she was received, and her recourse to novels, her recourses to colonial novels, which presented alternative ways of reading this world, of helping her read, which we will see how she reads the archives and concerns with intimacy later on. So I would say that out of this beginning, what I most learned from Anne was an approach to theory, not simply as theory as a meta commentary, to be used, applied, proved, supported, or disproved, but as claims about the world to be read as symptomatic of that world. In other words, Anne continuously reads, she does read against the grain, but she reads with the grain so brilliantly. This gives her an ability to restructure theoretical traditions, not simply by challenging and proposing principally novel, newly branded theory with a capital T, but by resituating that theory, attending to the conditions of its production and to its, most of all, to its productive effects on the world. Theory here stands as something of a colonial or imperial archive that constantly denies what it really does, even as it claims or is claimed to enlighten us in other ways that may or not be relevant, but consistently seem relevant. This attention to productivity emanates from, is influenced by, is read through Foucault to an extent in Anne's work. That's clear. But in reading Anne, I both see Foucault, especially the early Foucault of archaeology of knowledge, and I think over and over that she doesn't, or no longer, or can do without Foucault. His influence is there and not there. Anne's reading with the grain, this reading of claims as both symptoms and productive forces that affect certain things in the world, is constantly performed with verb and erudition and political commitment in relation to evidence whose truth claims and cradles, resituates, contests, and most of all follows into the connective tissue of institutions and lives, and thus of affects, aesthetic judgments, and power relations that often go unnoticed as power relations or core components of modern politics. So race and empire. In 1975, Toni Morrison stated, the function, the very serious function of racism is distraction. It keeps you from doing your work. It keeps you explaining over and over again your reason for being. Somebody says you have no language, so you spend 20 years proving that you do. Somebody says your head is just not properly. So you have scientists working on that fact that it is.
Yeah.
Someone says that you have no art, so you dredge that up. Somebody says you have no kingdom, so you dredge that up. None of that is necessary. There will always be one more thing. Now this, none of that is necessary, reminds me so much of Anne's work in 1997 on racial regimes of truth, right? On the insistent, on the habitual ways that social scientists move towards a resuscitation and excavation and a pinpointing of origins. But none of this is necessary. What Anne's work taught me is that somehow, yes, none of this is necessary, but it is necessary. It is deemed necessary in the world in which we live. How it becomes necessary and with what effects, in my humble reading of her work, is one of her signal contributions to understanding not simply better race and empire, but any social situation that we engage. I was alerted to Morrison's words by a recent iconoclastic take on structural racism and culpability by Jonathan Rosa and Vanessa Diaz, an American anthropologist. I'll return it to make it. For the moment, let me just say that Morrison's critique reminds me of this 1997 critique by Anne. But Anne's point, I'm sorry, I lost my, I'm trying to go fast. Rosa and Diaz bring up the issue of what they call anthropological empiricism. They make the point that the hallowed 2-year collection of fieldwork evidence is but a part of longer lives, especially of anthropologists of color who face particular forms of ongoing discrimination and even dispossession, and do not necessarily need a discrete period of fieldwork to make important points about race and power, even as the two do not disavow an ethnographic empiricism. So in extracting this point from a longer, more complex article and into Anne's work, I recall something that Mandana mentioned in her introduction of me. I have to say, I spent my entire childhood with poison ivy between my toes and my fingers. But in the last week, I have learned of the intense fevers, stomach aches, swelling, unbelievable pain that poison ivy can generate. And this was not from hanging out on vacation. I found myself last week dangling 20 feet in the air, having to embrace a poison ivy vine in order not to fall off a deer stand that I was trying to hang on a tree with a group of working class men in central New Jersey. Subsequent to that, I had to take a saw and cut it, and the shavings fell down my shirt and covered my head. Why am I telling you this? not revel in some sort of ethnographic authenticity, a macho return to the origins of humankind through hunting in the Garden State of all places. Rather is to point out something of everyday experience, the realization of the course of my fieldwork, of the extent to which my job is without risk. I'm conducting fieldwork with people like telephone linemen or heavy equipment operators, or some of the remaining tool and die makers in New Jersey, who in fact earn wages that are higher than CUNY professors. They're very wealthy in some ways, but they are in many ways also working class. They remind me that my job is without risk. Their job is with extraordinary risk. I'm not pointing out this risk to somehow equate, ignoring class or equating class, the risks faced by people of color, whether it's police, environmental racism, getting a mortgage in our society, to a white working class. Please don't misinterpret me. But I am constantly amazed and then crushed by the contradictions of fieldwork with people who are hardcore conservatives, committed Trumpers, and even more committed critics of my type. And this issue of risk and pain is one way into it. Sorting is basic to the work of Ann Stoler. Not necessarily that she sorts things out, but she is brilliant in her ability to demonstrate how both sorting goes awry and how it produces new effects, functioning as a technique of power that severs, rendering some subjects problematic and others insightful. So let me return to Ann's words. This comes from the postscript to 2018 Ethnographies of US Empire, in which she's in discussion with Carol McGranahan. She says, beyond the actual connection of things, we need to look at the conceptual interconnection of problems and who and what are made into them. That is, we need to ask not only how things are assembled, but how they are disassembled, conceptually and politically severed from the conditions that made them possible. At issue here is something that Fernando Coronil, dear friend, colleague, interlocutor, who was supposed to be with us, as you know, for this conference, both of us thought of as relational histories that are made into non-relational ones. We see this so clearly in the US imperial script, that Samoa is not related to the Philippines, is not related to Nicaragua, is not related to Iraq. Let me ask a question here. You've just put that out geographically, spatially, and I would be interested in talking in the follow-up in how you do that temporally, moving from rupture and recuperation to, right, to,
Sure.
okay.
That's great.
So let me finish up here by saying my brilliant and committed anthropological colleague, Anand Pandian at Johns Hopkins, has just published in The Guardian an insightful article called What I Learned from an Unlikely Friendship with an Anti-Masker. Pandian recognizes, and I'm quoting, is our capacity to wound and be wounded by others. Yet he never takes up his interlocutor, Frank's, request that Pandian come out of his cocoon. And related to this cocoon, I'm intrigued by the title of his essay, What I Learned from an Unlikely Friendship with an Anti-Masker, and how I read that title in relation to Anne's concern with the way that things come together and are rendered. Why is this friendship unlikely? And also, I would say, with her concern with the way that the anti-war movement disguised its racial project. Why is this friendship unlikely? And why is it so easy to write and to be accepted by what my fieldwork interpreters in New Jersey would say call my type? I know why Anand Pandian's friendship is unlikely, of course. But what of friendship, which is indeed always unlikely? Or is it simply that I have trouble making friends? How and why are some friendships deemed unlikely? Friendship, like the colonial desire Anne explores, is always unlikely. How is it that anthropologists today, in their best effort and sincere and politicized engagements, contribute to the policing of desire and friendship, and thus definitions of those who are not or should not be related? As Anne says, we need to ask not only how things are assembled, but also how are they disassembled, conceptually and politically severed from the conditions that made them possible. So I had an inkling as I began thinking through this, and Anne said, Anne talked to us about her, not race and empire, but the structural conditions of inequality and subsumption in Marx. One of the things, Anne, I really was going to ask you is, gosh, when I think about the trajectory of your work, yes, it's about race and empire. But as you said, I never wanted to write about race. It's about so much more. It's about basic social analysis and how we can perform this fearlessly and how we can somehow reach a perch out of which to recognize the habitual ways of conducting this analysis and wrench ourselves out of them, not necessarily by going against the grain, but by following the grain, by following the analysis to its logical conclusion. So in doing that, and in thinking about these people in New Jersey with who saved me as I fall 20 feet holding on to vines that are filled with a certain poison. Many of them are good people. And then we descend into racism, into statements that I cannot abide by, that cause me to be labeled in certain ways, that cause great dissension. I think about my culpability in that, my participation in that, the types of questions, the methods of ethnography that have become habitual to me, that are part of all of our educations, and how it is that we might move out of them. And I think of Donald Trump. The mishmash, his diction, his sentence structure is a fine, fine example of rendering and fragmentation that is so much a part of imperial formations. His ability to speak of America first, we must get out of foreign wars, and then we must take the oil from shithole countries. This strange occlusion of the obvious, the statement of the obvious, but the wrenching apart and the pushing together through both ambiguities and statements that seem clear but are hardly ambiguous, and ambiguities that pass for ambiguities but are in fact clear dog whistles to racists. He's an unbelievable symptom of empire, but not simply because he falls into the easiest categories of empire. So in trying to take seriously the way that we have long taken seriously Zonde magic, or the way that we, in the ontological turn today, attempt to take seriously the power of non-human objects, even if one is of an anthropologist who doesn't ascribe to a certain theoretical stripe. How is it that I can begin to take seriously the claim that there are good people on both sides and retain my clear-eyed knowledge, my clear-eyed interpretation that this is part of a problematic political formation that my career depends upon contesting? But the manner of my contestation is productive, and probably productive of the form taken by that which I'm claiming to contest, which is why I brought up this issue of friendship. My unlikely friendship with a hunter that cannot be published together. I have to have the voice to sanitize it for a wonderful press I would love to publish for, perhaps. How is it that do we structure a social science, a political engagement that takes seriously the two sides? I would say that Anne's writings on the assemblages and the disassemblages of empire, the way that racial formations enter into that, is extraordinarily productive, extraordinarily helpful to me. I don't know my way out. I don't have a clear answer for you. But I began by saying that it's easy to think race and difficult to think race and empire in New Jersey, and it's difficult to think it, the two, undoubtedly. But I think that as my question to Anne, that she seems to have already responded to, the idea that this work is about so much more than race and empire, even though race and empire are everything. We cannot think the US or the world without race and empire. And it's extraordinarily productive for me to be here to, as somebody trained in work in Latin America, to think about how people in the Middle Eastern studies are thinking about race, because there's a similar issue. So for example, in Brazil in the 1990s, there's so much talk about the way that North American race befuddled social scientists are imposing our fetishism upon a Brazil which is not plagued by the same problems. And so there's ideas that it works very, very differently, and that perhaps it's out of place. And so the attempt by people who are working in a very different part of the world to think through a concept that is so intimately associated with the North American Academy and North American politics is, of course, fascinating to me. But more than that, I have to say, and I will close here, I am troubled and pushed forward in this project by Anne's ability to, and this is why I began with capitalism and confrontation, to deal with the ambiguities of a splintering, a severing, a disassociation, alongside a blending, a series of ambiguities that cause us to either focus on that disassociation or that disassemblage, or to miss completely the extent to which it pushes us into realms that cause us to not simply miss what is happening, but participate in precisely that which we believe we critique. So I hope I've been clear in some way. This has been an extraordinary experience. I look forward to talking more and to hearing from all of you. Thank you very much. Thank you, Anne. Thank you, everybody here.
Thank you, John.
Thank you, Jen.
So, Anne, you want to take some time and respond to Marie's amazing questions and John's, I think, almost provocation question.
They should be provocations.
Yes,
Both of them. Great.
yes, exactly. So, and yeah, take your time and respond. That would be great. We'd love to hear from you.
Thank you so much, both of you, for the time and energy and carefulness with which you came to these issues. I don't want to take up all the time because I'd actually love to hear from some of the students and the faculty who, took off from a gorgeous day this afternoon and are here. I'd love to have you all in my classes. That would be absolutely wonderful too. And I'm not sure I want to respond to every single question in some way at all. But I'm just going to say some things that are going to leave things a bit high and dry. One thing is, I think starting with good people is a real problem. And for all the reasons that John is bringing up. That to imagine, as I think I did when I was younger, that they're only good people who are subaltern, and that everybody else is kind of a shit, was so unproductive and so unhelpful. And I spent a huge amount of time in the archives of this one family. That's the end of the Along the Archival Grain book, 2 chapters of this guy who is trying to play both sides in some way. He was committed to the colonial project, but also felt he was sort of totally destroyed by it. And at the same time, he was trying to learn how to be a loving father, but he was, for 5 years, 7 years, he never saw his daughter. And he would ask, tell me about your doll. What do you call that doll? Right? He was part of the colonial service. He'd say, write to me in 2 languages and I'll help you. I'll correct them for you. Remembering that letters took 4 months to go back and forth. There was something about his own self-deception, but that was not a self-deception, that kept turning me to say, what do you mean good and bad? So when I was studying the Front National, and I'd go to a cafe after one of the demonstrations and sit next to one of the couples that had been in the demonstration and look at what they were wearing and look at what they were talking about. I mean, you couldn't tell them from me, right? I mean, they were just having a nice conversation. They were not bad, intrinsically bad people, even though my side were those people who were really getting shafted. I've never found that discussion of good and bad. I mean, it's from, you know, Nietzsche taught it to us. It's beyond good and evil. How do those concepts get, and those beliefs get solidified? But there's nothing in them. There's absolutely nothing. And it's the same with morality. Those are shifting spaces. There's nothing of the bottom line on either of them. It's our job to understand how they get strengthened so much. Why does it become easy to just take them as the habitus in which we live, and we don't have to ask him? So one of the things that's really influenced me a lot in the last 10 years and really shaped what, like, so much has plunged inside it. And it's going to sound really, oh my God, you're going abstract. First of all, one, I never use the word theory. I hate the word theory. I think theory paralyzes people. I think it paralyzes graduate students. I think they have to learn theory and then plug it into their ethnography. I think theory is a real serious problem. And it's always with a capital T, even though it's not written with a capital T. And there's just too many kudos applied to it. You're not allowed to use theory in my courses. What you can do is think about something I call concept work. That working with concepts, not applying them, not taking them as authorizations of your own acumen, not using them in that way. You may never use a concept, I argue, in my seminars, unless you do something with it. You may never say, and the biopolitical terms of this are, you're not allowed. It's just, I don't allow it. It's not what happened. Because if you do that, you believe that you're doing something when you're doing nothing. What I want to see, and what I want to do in my own work, is take something and make it do work on its edges, right? Derrida said something wonderful once. He says, I want to see how to reveal the ways in which concepts reveal the sites of their making and cloud the sites of their making. What does that mean? What does that mean, sites of their making? It's not about doing a Catholic project of the history of concepts. It's about seeing the work they do in the world, right? How people with whom we work are constantly developing various kinds of what the ancient Greeks called phronetics. They called it phronesis, not phonetics. It's phronesis. It's ethical wisdom. It's language which is not that of Sophia. It's not that on high. It's that which is on the ground. And what I call this talk, and I'm not trying to evade your specific questions. This for me is what gels the kinds of questions you ask. I call this talk trajectories, in the plural, of discomfort on rough ground. And Foucault's notion that critique is about the ethics of discomfort, to me is gold. Because once you get comfortable, right? Whether it be in the anti-war movement and you're so cool and you know everything, or in the feminist movement, or in the decolonial moment, you are lost. You have stopped asking what constitute. I'm not talking about microaggression. I really appreciated the sense that Marie and John had. For me, there's a term that Gaston Bachelard used, a philosopher. Philosophy, as you see, has been really important to me, but not because it's on high. He says, what I'm endeavoring to do is write an epistemology of the detail. I think that's gorgeous. That's about thinking what you know and most importantly, how you know it. What do you imagine are the means by which you know? Do you know colonialism by its rationalities and logic? Do you know colonialism by the distributions of sentiments that some are allowed and some are not? How you know, to me, has become one of my chapters is called How Not to Know. How to not to know when you know. How to set up that space, how to examine that space that allows elisions, that allows that, and it's not just ignorance. There's so many other dimensions of it. So this concept work in the sense of not just, I mean, I started, if anyone asked me where my work started, it's the politics of knowledge. It's the first course I ever taught as a first course as at the University of Wisconsin. I taught on the politics of counterinsurgency in Southeast Asia. I taught on something that was not supposed to be about South. It was supposed to be a course in ethnography. But everything about that ethnography was shaped in some way by the politics of knowledge and how it was constructed. And one of the best books on Vietnam and Anthropology at War, by Eric Walken at Berkeley, got his PhD at Berkeley, got his MA in Madison, was written in that class. I mean, he wrote better than I did on it. He got it. He interviewed Eric Wolf. He interviewed all the guys who were against the war. But he was understanding something about how counterinsurgency was actually part of the making of that knowledge. And that's where I began, you know, with Southeast Asia was part of a political military name. There was no Southeast Asia before that. So somehow thinking about the politics of knowledge and how we know what we know is, for me, open the door to affect sentiment, not affect in Masuni's way. Way before he was doing that, way before that became hot. It was about how you govern and how, as so funny, Jim Scott wrote How Not to Be Governed. He didn't realize that was Foucault. He told me, he didn't realize, he never quoted, that was Foucault's definition of critique. How not to be governed by these people in this way. And I think that's what, you know, has guided me in so many ways. The reason I don't ever use the word legacy to talk about colonialism is because it holds it too tightly into a moment. Foucault once wrote in Archaeology of Knowledge, stay away from words like influence and legacy. They are ready-made, he said, ready-made syntheses that will get in your way, because you will imagine you already know. You know, it's a legacy of colonialism, sure. It's, you know, I was so influenced by him. Unless you take those things apart, it's such a hard project. And I don't want to just use the word deconstruct, but it is about taking things apart. How do they get congealed? So one of the things I'm doing for the last 10 years on this project on political concepts, a critical lexicon, is not only to look at things that are already deemed political, those spaces we already have assigned political, but all the other parts of life that are not given that kind of authorization to be considered political. And I think, you know, we can see it in lots of people's works now, right? From Saidiya Hartman to all kinds of people say, look elsewhere, right? And Foucault's penser autrement, let's think otherwise. What's the point of writing unless you don't come out thinking so otherwise? The migraines, oh my God, the migraines. I think those migraines are just the unbelievable awareness of liberal guilt, of where I was, that when the week was over, I was going to go into town and buy cookies at the Chinese store, that I was going to eat ice cream. I would never go to a hotel. The first time I went to a hotel in Java was someone I adore and respect enormously. The first graduate student I ever did fieldwork with, Karen Strassler, who's one of your wonderful professors. And we had to stay at a hotel. I mean, we didn't have any, we couldn't stay anywhere. I said, Karen, what are we doing? I've never stayed in a hotel in my life in Java. I mean, that's disgusting. She said, Anna, you can do that. That's a part of it. You got to admit that's where we are. And we would sit together with other people, translating Javanese into Indonesian, going every day to see these women who were former nursemaids and cooks. But I was so tortured, and I hate to use that word because it's not a fair use of the word, but what I wanted to do and what I actually was. So the AID came to me in the village I was living in, Sumatra, in one of their big white cars with a flag on it, and said, we want you to come to Washington and tell us about the poor in Indonesia. And we'll pay you $1,000. And you know, I'm 25, you're 28 years old. I'm like, what? You're coming to me to tell you about exactly what you've helped create? And I refused to go. And I'm not saying I was so moralistic and so great, but that was constantly an issue for me, is who do you talk to? And a lot of my friends said, why aren't you? You've been criticizing the World Bank for years. Why don't you talk to them and set them straight? I said, because they're never going to be set straight. That's not who they are. They're structured in dominance, as Stuart Hall would say. They're absolutely structured in dominance. And me coming is just a good excuse for them. And, you know, these are not, oh, I was so good. No, I wasn't. I guess that's what's so upsetting, is that when I first read Julie Ellison's piece when I was teaching in Michigan called A Short History of Liberal Guilt, oh my God, I taught it every year after that, because it was so clearly shaping everything we did, not only in ethnography, but across the social sciences. We were just more, you know, looking at our navels more than other people were. But that was it. So I really thought this was really powerful. Toni Morrison's thing that you brought up, John, of race is distraction, right? I just found that, before I go to that, I wanted to say where I went with the concept work for a second. A project that's sort of keeps almost failing on me and is the center of what I do. And it's a project that's called Fieldwork in Philosophy. And I gave a set of lectures on it in Germany. I was asked to publish it as a book at Princeton. I taught a seminar on it. I did a Santa Fe seminar on it with an amazing range of people, with my young colleague, Nick Langlitz. And it was a concept that was developed, used by Austin, one line. It was elaborated by Bourdieu, and it became something that Paul Ravenel defined himself as an unbelievably amazing interlocutor for me. But I didn't want to go where any of them went. I wanted a different kind of grounding of it. And I think as Wittgenstein, it's not always me taking, you know, in an eclectic way, everybody. It's the language they use that gets me sometimes. Wittgenstein said in the Philosophical Investigations, we need to get to rough ground, to the friction of rough ground. And somehow the pretense that anthropology always imagines itself already there. We're always on rough ground. We do the real, right? We're always right in the trenches. Just struck me so much, and probably accounts for why I get invited more to comparative literature, philosophy, history, keynote addresses, et cetera, than anthropology. I'm not seen by many people as an anthropologist. You know, it's just, you know, I wonder if Rough Trio, if he had lived, wouldn't have anymore been seen as one either, because of his silence in the past. And the other books he's written on Haiti. It was very interesting how, you know, what makes you a real anthropologist? So that's a whole other issue, but the fieldwork in philosophy remains with me now that I finished this other book. It is something I think I'm doing all the time. I have to figure out how to do it, show it, live it, be it. And probably it will change the terms of what fieldwork is and a philosophy for myself. I don't know if it will do that for anybody else. Maybe that's enough to let other people have some more space, since we only have, a short time.
We only have half an hour, but there's some questions, of course, in the chat for you, Anne. And I'm going to return to those in a second, but I wanted to sort of follow up Marie's question, her other questions that she asked you about joy in the archive.
Yes, I wanted to get to that. Thank you.
I thought those were like such brilliant, questions. I wanted to, if you could take a moment and address that question. She was also asked you about the violence. Anyway, this sort of went in two directions, and I was wondering if you could. I know you're tired.
No, I'm not tired. I'm never tired.
Those are such great questions, and if you could take a moment.
I'm not at all. Thank you. Thank you for turning me back to that. I mean, I think the second question is on violence, is one that is really permeating my work in so many different kinds of ways. In a way, I don't feel it is necessary to address it because it doesn't actually show up as many contradictions. What it does is show that there's a more capacious space in which I've been trying to explore what it is to be in the flesh. And that word is very prominent in this new book. But it's not, let me, I'm not trying to appropriate a discourse and an enormously amazing set of studies in Black studies on the flesh, right? On the skin, on their permeability. But this issue comes up amazingly in some of the materials I'm looking at from way back. I mean, way back, not in my work, but far before it. But the joy thing, I think, shows up the contradictions a lot. Because I think I'm of a generation that, I was looking for all the ways in which capitalism and colonialism just really destroyed people. And I've been asked, like in the Imperial Durabilities piece, I have one line saying, duress is not only about the durability of duress, but about endurance in the face of it. And students have asked me, said, why did you give so little space to that endurance? It's funny, the piece I've done on Palestine is more about that, but it's oblique to it. It won't even refer to colonial archives. It's like creating an archive. It says, we're not talking back to them. Forget Israel for a second. Let us talk in a different way. Which I find really, really enabling in a way. Bernard Harcourt, a lawyer at Columbia, who defends people on death row in Arkansas, has written a beautiful piece in the Thinking with Balibar piece on counter. What is counter? Counter is not just going against colonialism. It's actually producing something new, right? And I love that definition of counter, not just knee-jerk. Okay, we're going to do this, but actually finding a space. When we look at the anti-colonial avant-garde, there was so much joyous space there. They dressed beautifully. They sat around with elegance. They wrote amazing poetry. Suzanne César said, forget Bougainvillea. We are in a different space, but she didn't forget joy. And I don't think, Marie, that I've gotten there close enough, because when I was in Java, in Sumatra, people had all kinds of spaces of joy, micro spaces of joy, of warmth, of touching, of all kinds of ways that they shared with me. So why isn't that present? Why did I not allow that to be present? I think it's a really great question. And I think it's still not as evident and as strong in my work as it could and should be. I got to a little bit of it on this thing on poetic rage and the avant-garde. I got to not joy, but a kind of, not even comfort, but an exuberant refusal in some way of precious things you wanted to hold on to, right? That were not museum appropriate. So there are things that produce some of that joy, and not just victimhood and not just, lack. But I don't think we've gotten there. So thank you, Marie.
Could I interject a comment?
Please.
It seems to me that thinking about joy, I think joy is harder to cite, right? I think it's harder to footnote joy, right? Much easier to footnote, and I'm putting this sort of in quotes, right? But to cite the violence or the moment. But how do you cite a space of joy, right? How do you cite or reference the bright colors and the things that people are wearing, or the smells and the sensation? I mean, this is something I struggle with.
And that's amazing, because that was my first work. I was working on the herbal drinks that poor women made from turmeric and all kinds of beautiful, beautiful smelling things from their gardens, because they were landless, a lot of them. And they'd put them on their backs, and they'd be wearing gorgeous batiks, and they would go to the market and sell them. And I was just entranced with them. I was buying all these old sarongs. And my world when I arrived in Java was a discomfort of how beautiful I found some of it, and disturbed when I saw plastic pails. So of course, when I took pictures, I made sure the plastic pails weren't there. Right, as if that wasn't part of the real for them. That was not the beginning of the plastic emergence of rivers are clogged now. I didn't write that story, right? I went and I danced at the Kraton at the palace. And the other thing I never talked about is the joy my sister gave to me in language and in words. She's a Sanskritist, and she translated poetry. And she translated the Mahabharata, and she translated the Bhagavad Gita, and she worked with Peter Brooks on his Mahabharata. And her life was one exquisite poem after another from the ancient epics. That was cute. She read me poetry at night rather than fairy tales. She was 9 years older than I. I didn't talk about that either. That was another kind of joy, and also an unbelievable stress, because I never thought I understood or was good enough to ever reproduce it. So each of these contradictions were part of it, but I didn't allow them in, as you're suggesting I might have and could do better.
So, Anna, I'm going to turn to a question that we were sent in the chat. It's a great question. And it, first of all, Christiana says, thank you for the inspiring talk. My question about the flexibility of race protocols and racialized categories and
Is that Christina Pastos?
Yes.
Oh, hello, my dear. Hello.
Formed in colonial settings, how do you see the ways they circulate through different locations and political formations, say, within and across empires and time? So it's a question about the circulation of racialized categories, and if you can comment on how you see those processes having emerged in the, the material, I think is what you're asking, of your research.
Well, as Christiana usually does, she's asking an impossible question that would take an entire book, right? And I could never answer it, because every piece of it is actually what I've tried to do. The moment that somebody who was considered native got to Singapore and pretended they were something else, or that they could be in another category, it's about all these locations of displacement, of what you can do when you move. What happens when you get to Paris, right? Do you reassert that, or does something else end up being who you are? I've been fascinated by watching the ways in which this is not directly Christianity, but it's the ways in which anti-colonial intellectuals would come to the École Normale, like the Césars, right? And how people assumed they were just borrowing, but actually they would just, it was just a stop on the way through all the other places they were moving. And until there was a way in which they became these different kinds of cosmopolitan beings. Ben Anderson once, before he died, gave an unbelievable talk at Columbia on the possibility of being cosmopolitan, but never moving from a particular place. How do you do that? But I think there's a lot of really powerful work being done, like a former student from Michigan, Kerry Ward, right? On all these circuits of knowledge production. It's a place that Fred Cooper and I started with Tensions of Empire, that they were sharing. This was a shared domain, right? In which they were reading each other, thinking each other, coming up with new categories for each other. But I think they were also used in different kinds of ways, you know, like by Jose Rizal. And how do you look back instead of being looked at? I think it's a great question, and I don't think I could answer it in any simple kind of way. There's too much really kind of a fabric of knowledge one needs to address it, and it needs to be really empirical. I really believe, and that's why the archives matter, it really needs not to be generalizations about what people who are mixed, how do you even get that category, what they do. It's got to be so, so close to the bone, right? So I feel like, I couldn't do better than follow you in doing it.
And I have a question for you. I mean, it's just sort of, I don't know why I never thought about it before, and I should have, but maybe it was something about your comment today about it's not about ignorance, it's about ignoring.
Yeah.
And it struck me that shift runs, and this is what I said earlier, what you do so beautifully is maintain these ambiguities and the power of those ambiguities. And it struck me that one of the things that is doing is not tiptoeing, sort of sliding on the question of intention.
That's great.
Right, and it sort of touches it, and then it leads, so the question of intention is sort of held in abeyance, while at the same time it's always there. Like and I was wondering if you could say if that makes sense to you. Does that resonate? And I don't know why, yeah. So it's just a question.
So at the end of a long, thank you. That's really powerful. And I never ever used the word intention. The word that I use and that I think is very powerful and very class-based is sincerity. Mm-hmm. Because over and over again, the question of whether colonized people could be sincere and even knew what sincerity was constantly there, constantly. And whether someone was sincerely and intended to be white or just somehow intended but never made it. Intention is so interesting in this, because if you look at this guy who I was studying so closely, there was not one intention there. There was not. I mean, he was upholding empire, he was turning against it. He had a daughter who ended up marrying one of the sugar barons. The intentionality, wow. I'm not talking about governance. I'm talking about people who lived those lives, right? And us, what's our intentions now? To be a good person and not be a racist? To follow, what does that matter? How do intentions rather than action matter? How do intentions versus practice matter? I think of anything, that is liberal guilt. that, oh, such good intentions. Oh, yes, I didn't mean to do that. Oh, yes, I never thought I was doing that microaggression. So, I mean, which I think is a problematic space, actually, because there's nothing micro about a lot of the things that people are actually talking about. There's nano racism now that, you know, one of my dear colleagues who I love, Achille Mbembe, uses. I'm not sure. I think it's nano at all. I think that those terms need to be understood, where they come from, how they get solidified, why they're so easy to live and so easy to think. But intention is constructed too, right? It has this reshaping all the time. And it's also retroactive. So there's a beautiful piece that really sustains me. This will be my last comment, even though it's so specific. It's John Austen's piece from 1951 called A Plea for Excuses. And it's gorgeous because he basically argues, I love it, that adverbs are the excuse. I didn't really want to do it. He wasn't truly like that. There are a million of them. And he looks at the space of what you're kind of denying you intended and pulling back from it. It's amazing. The excuse, I mean, empire is that. Imperial formations are precisely always the caveat, always the caveat. We didn't really mean it. You didn't mean it, or you didn't really mean it, meaning you are holding yourself apart from it. So I think it would be, you know, it's fascinating to look at intention with the excuse and with all the ways in which you get to hold it in abeyance, your own culpability. I've talked enough, I'm telling you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that, Anne. And, you know, I have to go back to the plea for excuses. So I have a couple more questions, if that's okay. Well,
Oh,
you know,
go ahead quickly.
okay.
Yeah.
And this has to do actually with a book that our students just read. And if you haven't had a chance to read it, then apologies, and you just say you haven't had to read it. But we'd love to, you know, have your thoughts on it.
If it's ethnography, I probably haven't.
Well, it was Gloria Vecker's White Innocence.
Oh, I know her well. Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
So
we gave 2 keynotes in Amsterdam together.
Did you?
Yeah.
So I'm just wondering, I mean, I hope this is okay, if you had some thoughts on that ethnography, because for I think some of the students, what was so fascinating about that was that it was taking your work in the archives, work in the Indies, and doing the ethnographic work of that, you know, let's use the word legacy without legacy then,
right.
In the Netherlands. And so I was just wondering about that conversation that you two might have, since you were, I mean, clearly you are in conversation.
Yeah, I mean, it's not just, it's not just Gloria, it's so many people trying to work in that intersection space. And I don't mean intersectionality, which, as you just saw from all the work we've talked about, this was there so far before people got excited about intersectionality. You couldn't study colonialism and imperial formations without it. And what's so strange, and what's the politics of this, is that it's not acknowledged ever. It's never, ever acknowledged. It is as if, I'm forgetting her name that I should remember, you know, invented it. This understanding that there is a sort of racial inflection to everything colonial and then a post-colonial inflection, people are just struggling with it in so many different ways. How to do what I think it was you, Marie, who said how to distinguish it and also know how much it's of a part, and how to find the categories of a polity. So this is, I'll end on this because I'm really excited about it. The categories of a polity that don't say the democratic is here, right? And the imperial is there. But the term that I'm using in this new book is imperial democracy. That there's no democracy that is not at the same time imperial, and there is no imperial that doesn't have all kinds of spaces of the democratic, of that this is it's an implication that's not metropolitan colony anymore. And that's what our world looks like much more. It's not that empire strikes back. The empire already was there, right? This notion that there was empire here, and there was a metropole here, and there was the colony here. I am far, I think, seeing this as something else much, much more powerful. Now, very traditional IR uses that term. And it was actually used by Arundhati Roy 20 years ago in a lecture that I've gotten hold of, and then it turns out it was a bad video with Chomsky. And I think it was Howard Zinn. And it's, I was just floored. I was using it in my book, and then I saw Arundhati Roy was using it in a very similar sense that I'm using it now, far beyond the IR, international relations, far beyond political science, you know. And it comes with the same emphasis that shadow zones, which is a really important concept in my book of imperial democracy, is not in the Middle East. The only place shadow zones were once allowed was in the Middle East. It's always ethnic strife. It's always primordial loyalty. It's always the tension of these shadow zones. I think the shadow zones are in Europe and the US. And I think they're around race. And it's so interesting that these sort of more conservative political scientists would have to assign the Middle East as the shadow zone rather than see it in all of the places in which we live. The thing about shadow zones, if you look it up on the net, is that this is this breaking of rock, really intense pressure. But in it, there are veins of treasured minerals running through them. And those are some of the really important spaces that we should be looking at more today. And lots of people are. I'm not doing it as much as many others. It's the shadow zones, as Marie noted, that I go to, really, that hard pressed space, but it produces something else. It doesn't produce victimhood. So those are the sort of some of the language that gets me further. Doesn't mean I have to have that language, but I think of methodologies, conceptual methodology. The two are absolutely entwined, and that I think radical scholarship comes from understanding that.
Okay, great. Well, I think we only have a few moments left, so I maybe want to close with a larger question that's coming out of some of the chatter that panelists have been having during your really interesting talk. But it was to ask, would you have any suggestions for how young scholars can be courageous in their work?
What a beautiful question. Well, I think that I try to do it all the time in teaching. I mean, try to let them know that if they're comfortable, they're in trouble. Let them know that if they find his papers easy to write, there's something amiss. It's understanding that there is no scholarship without the political, that it doesn't matter. If it doesn't, you know, David Scott said something really good once. I mean, not that we're close buddies, but I really love it. He said, are these questions worth having answers to? Do you know how that unsettles students? And I ask it to myself every day, are these questions worth having answers to? Are you doing this to get a degree? Are you doing it because you're getting a fellowship? Are you doing it because you have a nice job at the New School or CUNY? Or are you doing it because you can use that privilege to do something that matters? Are these questions worth having answered? To me, Christina, that makes you have to confront. You cannot just do it because it's fun. Yeah, it can be fun and exciting, but it got to matter. It's got to matter to the world, which we're destroying all the time, and the inequities that we still hold. So that's a great question. And I think of it absolutely all the time. So thank you.
Well, it seems like we're right on
Wow.
time.
Yeah.
And I know that there are many other people who would love to reach out. I'm sure that there are many who are just knowing who's here. I suspect that there are some people who may be a little intimidated, but they shouldn't be.
Right.
They shouldn't be. And I encourage everyone to please reach out. I know that they have questions. I know that they want to hear more. But thank you so much, Anne, John, Marie. This was just exactly what I hoped.
Oh,
right?
that's lovely.
That, we would hear from you, have a conversation. It'll go in different directions. And it was just really inspiring and important. So really,
Well, thank you for organizing it. Thank you all for organizing. But I want to say something to those, because I say it to my own students. There's so many students who feel so uncomfortable, even speaking up in a seminar of 20 people. And I always ask them to come to my office hours, talk about what they want to talk about, and then I'll stand behind them in a way when they try to raise it. So many people feel intimidated. When I was a graduate student and an undergraduate taking graduate courses, I used to absolutely get paroxysms. I had to write down every question because I was so scared. And so you learn not to be scared. I think that's really, you learn in a certain way. I also wanted people to know, I have office hours. I have office hours on Wednesdays. It's on Zoom now because of COVID. And that's how we're doing it. But I have office hours 3:30 to 5:30 Wednesdays. And, I care to hear what people are doing and how they're doing it. And sometimes I have to take my graduate students or my doctoral students because they're in the midst of it. But I will try to make room for those who really don't feel comfortable raising issues in this place. So thank you again for organizing. It was a true pleasure. It was really a true pleasure.
Well, it was wonderful. Thank you so much, Anne. Thank you, everybody. We look forward to being in touch more.
Okay, thank you both. Thank you, dear John. Thank you. Thank you, Marie.
I'm going to stay on for just a few more minutes.
Okay.
I wanted to let everybody.
You want me to get off or do you want me to stay?
No,
on?
you can stay on. You can. I'm happy. It's up to you. I don't
no,
want to. I don't want to take any more of your time, but I'd love to.
Okay. Okay. Well, I'd love to have a debriefing with you. That would be fun.
That would be really fun. I'm
Let's do
around.
Let's do it, or even let's do it tomorrow, just on a phone conversation, whatever.
That would be great.
Okay.
I
Be
would love
well,
that.
everyone. Thank you again.
Thank you so much, Anne. Thank you. It's lovely to hear you.
I'll stay on.